I think a lot of Bulls fans knew it was inevitable that if the Bulls didn't at least make it to the NBA Finals this season, or maybe even win an NBA championship, that head coach Tom Thibodeau was going to be shown the door. I think this was something that all of us Bulls fans understood was a very real and likely possibility, and we had prepared ourselves for that possibility. I think as time went along, we started to understand more and more that the Bulls had their replacement already in mind and that we knew it was going to be former Bull, Iowa State head coach Fred Hoiberg. We had prepared ourselves, I guess, for that possibility and understood that that was what was going to happen. Thibodeau was going to be shown the door, and Fred Hoiberg was going to get that red carpet treatment. And that's exactly what happened. Shortly after the NBA playoffs ended for the Chicago Bulls, they decided to part ways with Tom Thibodeau, and they couldn't wait to bring in Fred Hoiberg. I guess. Well, I'll start off by saying this, and I need to address this first when it comes to Tom Thibodeau, because I think some Bulls fans believe that he should have kept his job and that he was the right guy for the job. You know, Tom Thibodeau is a good coach to a degree. And he is a guy that, to a degree, can get a lot out of his players. And he's a guy that can get you to a certain point. I don't disagree with that. You know, in terms of coaching ranks in the NBA, from a pure coaching standpoint, Thibodeau is probably in the top 10 for sure. I don't dispute that. And I understand that a lot of Bulls fans look at this team and say, yeah, they're disappointed that they didn't at least make the Eastern Conference Finals or maybe the NBA Finals. But you're talking about a coach who continues to find ways to get to a certain point with the team that deals with injuries and this and that. And, you know, you look at the progression of a guy like a Jimmy Butler. You have to say, what Thibodeau have to do with that? You know, I understand why a lot of Bulls fans in some ways are loyal to Thibodeau and are sad to see him go. But the simple fact of the matter is, this playoffs this year should have shown you why it was time for Tom Thibodeau to go. I mean, I even go back to that first round series against the Bucks. That was a series where they go up 3-0. They should sweep those jokers. They should let them know that you don't have a chance this year. Come back and see us again a year later with Jabari Parker, and then we'll worry about you. Instead, the Bucks find a way to win 2 straight games, and a series that should have been a relatively easy but physical sweep for the Bulls ended up being a 6-game battle. Even with that big blowout, obviously, in Game 6. It shouldn't have gotten to that point. And then you get to the series against the Cavaliers. And to me, it really speaks to the flaws in Tom Thibodeau as a head coach, and especially as the coach of the Bulls at that point in time. When his team is struggling offensively, he continues to emphasize defense. When his team lacks creativity and originality and a philosophy, frankly, on the offensive side of the ball, he continues to talk about defense. When his team goes down 20 points early in Game 2 of that series against the Cavs, you remember that. They were getting run out of the gym early. Instead of, when he's asked what they need to do to get the offense going and maybe needs to talk about shaking up the lineup or doing this or doing that, he's talking about defense and talking about how the defense will create the opportunities. No, not everything is about defense, and that's the ultimate problem with Tom Thibodeau, is that at the end of the day, everything is always about defense with him. And you could see in the series against the Cavs how the Bulls lacked creativity and originality in terms of the lineups they ran, the type of offense that they run, the offensive sets that they did. It was just time for him to go. He was horrible, in my opinion, in terms of understanding what lineups to run with and when. He was too loyal to certain guys. He was too hard and too impatient with other guys. It was just time. I mean, this was a Cavaliers team that wasn't that particularly great. You know, that the Bulls, with their so-called superior depth, were supposed to be able to utilize that superior depth, their superior size down low, to their advantage, and they failed to do so. This was a Cavs team they should have beaten in 5, maybe 6 games, and instead they lost to them in 6 games. It was time. He had to go. I mean, it was so frustrating to watch a Tom Thibodeau coach Bulls team because this was a guy that micromanaged to the nth degree. So often he was in too big of a hurry, to call timeouts. He would try to structure too many things. You could see it many times where the Bulls needed to get out and run, but they were slowing down because they were thinking about what Thibodeau would want, and Thibodeau would always want them to be in the half court. And that wasn't the best formula for success for this Bulls team. I look at throughout that series against the Cavs again, his inability to find ways to get Gasol more consistently involved was absolutely mind-blowing to me. The fact that he had a long wing defender like a Tony Snell, who's not great, but he's something, and at least he's a live body who can occasionally hit a three-point shot, and failed to utilize him in that series on LeBron to at least give Jimmy Butler some type of spell. The fact that in the first couple of games he didn't go to Mirotic at all in that series for whatever the fuck reason, and then when he did, Mirotic had some flashes but then struggled in part because he didn't get a rhythm early on in that series. And just so many things made it clear to me that it was time for Tom Thibodeau to go. And I think if you're sitting there trying to make the argument that Thibodeau needed to stay, you're flawed and you're mistaken. No, he got the team to a certain point, but they were never going to get past a certain point with Tom Thibodeau because they never did get past a certain point with Tom Thibodeau. And if they weren't going to be able to get it done this year with Tom Thibodeau, when the hell were they ever going to? I mean, seriously. And then when you look at the whole battle between him and the front office, I never understood why Jerry Reinsdorf would hire the guy, but John Paxson and Gar Forman weren't on board with it. You've got one side trying to undercut the other side trying to undercut the other. You would think Jerry Reinsdorf would have learned his lesson from back in the day with Jerry Krause and Phil Jackson, that that's a toxic environment, and eventually those chickens are going to come home to roost, and it's going to be an ugly situation. But yet, here it is. Thibodeau is hired. Foreman and Paxson are never on board with it. Thibodeau's not on board with them. It's just nonstop conflict, battle, and all types of bullshit. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And again, this goes back, for those of you that may be even old enough to remember that are watching this video, this goes back to the late 80s to me with the Bulls and Doug Collins. Collins was a good coach. The Bulls got to a certain point with him, but they also got to a certain point and weren't going to get any farther with Doug Collins. And that's when Jerry Krause fired Doug Collins and promoted an assistant who had once coached for the Albany Patroons of the CBA, and that guy's name was Phil Jackson, and the rest, as they say, is history. And this was a Doug Collins coming off of an Eastern Conference Finals appearance as the head coach of the Chicago Bulls. But it got to a point where he understood that Doug Collins wasn't going to be that guy to take them all the way, that it was time for a different voice, a different philosophy, what have you. And it's a similar boat here for Tom Thibodeau with the Chicago Bulls, and that's why he had to go. And again, if you argue that it's ridiculous that they fired him based off of that, you're wrong. He needed to go. Now, on the flip side, if you make the argument and say, well, just firing somebody for the sake of firing somebody and bringing somebody else in isn't automatically an upgrade. It isn't automatically a good thing. Look, I agree with that notion too, and I understand that notion. But you could sit there and point to a team like the Golden State Warriors. The Warriors were doing okay. Mark Jackson was the guy as the head coach, but he was having problems with the front office and vice versa. They fire him and they bring in a guy with no previous NBA head coaching experience in Steve Kerr. And now the Golden State Warriors find themselves in the NBA Finals, potentially poised to win an NBA championship for the first time in the last 40 years in that organization's history. Sometimes you don't know what could happen. People talk about Greg Popovich and how great of a coach he is, but this was a guy that was once a general manager and stepped down from being general manager, so to speak, in a way, to become the team's head coach. He was no proven commodity. He was no guaranteed any damn thing. We just never know. So at some point in time, sitting there and saying, well, you might not necessarily get better, this is the best you got, is not a good enough argument. In Thibodeau's case, it isn't. The end of the day, if you've established and proven that a guy isn't going to take you to the championship and isn't going to win you a championship, he no longer serves a purpose for you and he must go. And that's the point the Bulls had reached with Tom Thibodeau. However, I don't understand the love affair with this Bulls organization when it comes to Fred Hoiberg. Now, let me get this straight. A guy who coached at Iowa State, the same guy who never really did anything in the tournament at Iowa State. And if I remember correctly, just a few months ago, it was his team that was getting bounced out of the tournament as a 3 seed by a 14 seed in the first round. This is the guy that the Bulls turned to. This is the guy that they said they could take them farther than Tom Thibodeau. At least Tom Thibodeau was getting his team to the second round of the NBA playoffs. Fred Hoiberg couldn't even get his team to the round of 32 in the NCAA tournament this year. When you had a lot of people picking in their brackets Iowa State to go to the Elite Eight, if not the damn Final Four. They couldn't get past the first game. And now this is the guy that you've decided to give $25 million to. This is the guy that you decide is so much better for you than Tom Thibodeau. Now look, I understand Hoiberg is a better offensive-minded coach, and that's exactly the type of coach that the Bulls need. I understand there's a comfort level there and a familiarity there from his time with the Bulls organization as a player. I understand that this is a Gar Forman and John Paxson choice, unlike Thibodeau, unlike Vinny Del Negro, who were clearly Jerry Reinsdorf choices. Again, I get that and I understand that. But if you're going to go to the college ranks, wouldn't you at least be maybe knocking on the door of a Calipari? You know, somebody who is really successful at that level. And you could sit there and say, well, Calipari, you've been at the NBA level before and it didn't go well. Yeah, that's true. But who's to say it wouldn't be the second time around? Because frankly, in a lot of ways, he was nothing more than an NBA coach at Kentucky any fucking ways. If I'm going to go down the college ranks, I'm going to go after somebody like a Calipari. Somebody who I know can coach professional players because, like I said, that's basically what he was at Kentucky. He was an NBA farm system. Instead, you're bringing in Fred Hoiberg. Fred freaking Hoiberg. A guy with some major medical issues pertaining to his ticker who just recently had an aorta replaced. This is the guy that you've chosen that can take you to that next level. I don't see it and I don't get it. I really, truly don't. And what's even more concerning about this to me is I'm a very big believer in history. And those that don't learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. I remember many, many years ago when the Chicago Bulls had Phil Jackson. And Jerry Krause couldn't wait for Phil Jackson to be shown the door. He couldn't wait for Phil Jackson to leave town. And everybody in Chicago knew that entire 97-98 season that Phil Jackson was going to be gone after that year, which meant Michael Jordan and everybody else was going to be gone. And that Jerry Krause had a big penguin hard-on for Tim Floyd from Iowa State. And that Tim Floyd was going to be the guy. And it was proven out that Tim Floyd from Iowa State was that guy. And then we know what happened from there. Now, granted, the situation that Tim Floyd was put into, nobody was ever going to succeed at. I grant you, I understand that. But again, it was Tim Floyd. He ran off a Hall of Fame coach, one of the best ever in Phil Jackson, for Tim fucking Floyd. Now the Chicago Bulls have run off one of the at least 10 best coaches in the NBA. Some might argue from a pure coaching standpoint, a top 5 coach in Tom Thibodeau, to bring in another guy from Iowa State that they've had a hard-on for in a long time in Fred Hoiberg, who had even less success, I would argue, at Iowa State than Tim Floyd did. This is what's frustrating about the Bulls. They're a team that in a lot of ways looks like they're more than they really are. And I've talked about over the past few seasons that it was foolish for so many people to believe that this team was a championship contender because they clearly were not, and I don't see how anybody could view them as such, and I was proven to be right, especially when Carlos Boozer was one of their big weapons. But this year, I looked at this team and I saw a team that had, you would think in theory, enough of the pieces in place, but as we found out, you had, even though Jimmy Butler played at a otherworldly level for him, you know, he was an all-star this year. Derrick Rose came back to form relatively nicely. They got a great, almost career year out of Paul Gasol, a solid year out of Mike Dunleavy. It wasn't enough. And now Fred Hoiberg's going to be the guy to take him to that next level? No. This just isn't a championship team. And at some point in time, you got to wonder, if you're not a championship team now, when are you going to be under your current construction? And I don't know if the Bulls are going to be. And at that point in time, doesn't it make sense to consider and entertain maybe shaking up the entire makeup of that roster and potentially blowing things up and starting over? I don't know. I get the firing of Tom Thibodeau. I understand it, and I agree with it. And I'm not just going to sit there and say, well, just because they hired a guy that I don't particularly agree with them hiring, that makes the Thibodeau firing bad. No, you have to look at it separately. Thibodeau had to go for many different reasons, as I've kind of outlined in this video. He had to go. But I don't know why the Bulls had to go with Fred Hoiberg. I don't get it. I don't understand it. This organization once had a chubber for an Iowa State head coach, and it was a disaster. And I'm starting to wonder if this will be more of the same thing.